physical therapists really mean when they talk about muscle tone?
Yeah.
It's one of those terms that gets thrown around, but today we're going deep,
Absolutely.
unpacking it all.
Yeah.
We got excerpts from a medical lecture on tone.
Oh, okay.
And while that might sound a little dry, trust me,
Right.
there's some really interesting stuff in here that impacts everyone, not just athletes or people in rehab.
It's true.
Muscle tone is way more fascinating than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll learn why the length of a muscle actually affects how strong it can be.
Oh, interesting.
It's kind of like, you know how a rubber band works best at a certain length?
Right, right.
And we'll even decode some of those head-scratcher medical terms,
Okay.
like decerebrate rigidity,
Yeah.
which, believe me, you'll want to understand.
All right.
So ready to get toned up on knowledge.
Let's dive in.
All right.
First things first, what is muscle tone? Clinically speaking, it's the resistance a muscle puts up when you try to stretch it passively.
So, like, if I let my arm just dangle versus holding it stiff,
Exactly.
there's a different feel there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the muscle fibers themselves. That resistance, that tone, comes from a bunch of things.
Okay.
The weight of your limb, the springiness of your tissues,
Yeah.
and this is key, your spinal reflexes.
Ah, so that's where our nervous system gets involved.
Yeah.
See, I always forget how much our nerves are running the show in the background.
It's a constant balancing act.
Really?
Your nervous system is making tiny adjustments to your muscle tension all the time,
Wow.
just to keep you upright and ready to move.
That's incredible.
It is.
Okay, so our source talks about something called the length-tension relationship.
Right.
It sounds like there's a sweet spot for muscle length where we're at, like, peak performance.
Precisely. Muscles are strongest when they're at their natural resting length.
Oh.
Too short or too stretched, and they lose power.
So, like, if you stretch a rubber band too far, it loses its snap.
Exactly. Same with your muscles.
So good form at the gym isn't just about avoiding injuries then.
Right.
It's about making sure our muscles are in that prime position
Yeah,
to work their hardest.
absolutely.
That's actually really helpful to know.
It's all connected.
Cool. So what happens when things get out of whack? The source material mentions tone abnormalities.
Right.
What does that even mean?
Well, like anything in our bodies, there's a healthy range for muscle tone.
Yeah.
When it's outside that range, we see what are called tone abnormalities.
Gotcha.
There are three main types.
Right.
Hypertonia, hypotonia, and dystonia.
So too much tone, too little, or just plain messed up?
Yeah, a simple way to put it.
Okay.
And these abnormalities can be caused by a bunch of different things.
Like what?
Injuries to the central nervous system, medical conditions, even side effects from certain medications.
So it's complicated.
It's a complex picture.
So we're really talking about a whole spectrum of possibilities here.
We are.
Let's dig into hypertonia first,
Okay.
since that seems like it might be fairly common.
Good point.
When we talk about hypertonia meaning too much muscle tone, there are two main types you'll hear about:
Okay.
spasticity and rigidity.
All right, break it down for us.
So what's the difference?
The key is how the muscle resistance changes with speed.
Okay.
Spasticity is what we call velocity dependent, meaning the faster you try to stretch the muscle, the more it resists.
Oh.
Rigidity, on the other hand, is constant, like trying to bend a lead pipe.
Oh, okay.
It's always going to be tough no matter how fast or slow you go.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
So with spasticity, it's like trying to open one of those really stiff pocket knives.
Right.
There's that initial resistance, and then it suddenly gives way.
You got it. That sudden release is what we call the clasp knife response.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, are there certain conditions that are more likely to cause one type of hypertonia versus the other?
Absolutely.
Like what?
Spasticity is often seen after a stroke or in people with cerebral palsy, where there's damage to the brain or spinal cord.
Okay.
Rigidity, on the other hand, is a hallmark of Parkinson's disease, which affects a different part of the brain.
Wow, so even though they both involve muscle tightness,
Right.
they can point to very different underlying issues.
It's fascinating how specific these signs can be.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And speaking of specific, our source material also mentions some really extreme forms of hypertonia.
Okay.
Decorticate and decerebrate rigidity.
Right.
Those sound intense.
They are.
What can you tell us about them?
These are severe conditions,
Okay.
usually caused by traumatic brain injuries.
Oh.
Imagine someone's arms are bent in towards their chest
Okay.
while their legs are straight out. That's decorticate rigidity. Almost like a mummy pose.
Okay, got the visual. And what about decerebrate rigidity?
Even more severe.
Oh, no.
In this case, the arms and legs are both stiffly extended.
Oh, okay.
The head is arched back,
Uh-huh.
and the body is completely rigid. It's
Mm.
considered a worse sign than decorticate rigidity, unfortunately.
While it sounds scary, I imagine recognizing these signs could be crucial,
Absolutely.
especially if someone's had a head injury.
Yeah,
It could mean getting them the urgent care they need. Right.
absolutely.
And it really highlights how delicate the balance is
It does.
between our nervous system and our muscles.
It really does.
So we've talked about hypertonia, where there's too much muscle tone.
Right.
What about the opposite?
Okay.
Hypotonia, where there's not enough.
Good question.
What's that all about?
Hypertonia is all about low muscle tone.
Mm.
Think floppy or loose muscles.
Okay.
Reflexes might be reduced too.
Uh-huh.
It's essentially a lack of resistance to movement.
So like a rag doll.
That's a great visual.
Okay.
And like hypotonia can have many different causes.
Like what?
Damage to the nerves that control muscles.
Yeah.
Problems with the cerebellum, which helps with coordination.
Right.
And even something called spinal shock after a serious injury.
Are there any common examples of hypotonia?
Sure.
I feel like I'm having trouble picturing it in real life.
Think of a newborn baby.
Okay.
They naturally have low muscle tone,
Right.
which is why they're so wobbly.
That's true.
As their nervous systems develop, their muscle tone increases,
Uh-huh.
and they gain better control of their movements.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
So it's not always a bad thing.
exactly.
It's all about context.
Exactly.
Now, I'm curious.
Yeah.
How do healthcare providers actually figure out what someone's muscle tone is like? Is there a specific test?
They actually use a combination of things.
Right.
Observation, passive movement testing, and active movement testing.
Okay, walk us through those.
Okay, so first, they simply observe the person's posture at rest.
Right. Are they slumped over?
Yeah.
Are their limbs held in unusual positions?
Okay.
That gives initial clues about their muscle tone.
So just looking for anything that seems out of the ordinary.
Exactly.
That's-
Then they'll move the person's limbs passively,
Okay.
feeling for resistance or looseness.
I imagine you'd need a pretty experienced hand to know what's normal and what's not.
You definitely need anatomical knowledge and a lot of practice.
Wow.
Then they'll do active movement testing,
Okay.
asking the person to perform specific movements
Uh-huh.
and watching how smoothly they can do them.
It's like putting all the pieces together to get a full picture of how the muscles are working.
Right.
And it's important to remember that muscle tone can change depending on a lot of different factors.
Oh, yeah.
Time of day, stress levels,
Right.
even the temperature of the room.
Wow. So many variables.
Our source mentions a tool called the Modified Ashworth Scale.
Oh,
What's
correct.
that all about?
The Modified Ashworth Scale, or MAS, is a common way to measure spasticity.
It's basically a grading system
Uh-huh.
that helps clinicians quantify the degree of resistance they feel when moving a limb.
So it takes the guesswork out of assessing spasticity,
Exactly.
making it more objective.
Exactly. It helps to track changes over time and see if treatments are working.
Okay.
Now,
Wow.
you might be wondering, why should the average person care about all this muscle tone business?
Yeah, it does sound pretty technical.
It can be.
What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, understanding muscle tone is crucial for recognizing potential problems.
Okay.
Difficulty with fine motor skills,
Uh-huh.
changes in your walk,
Yeah.
unexplained stiffness.
Right.
These could all be related to tone abnormalities.
Oh, wow.
Early detection is key to getting the right treatment.
So it's about being aware of subtle changes in our bodies.
Exactly. Tuning into those signals and knowing when something might be off.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this seemingly obscure topic actually has a lot of relevance to our
Right.
daily lives. Before we move on, I have a little challenge for our listeners.
Okay.
Next time you're walking, really pay attention to how your muscles feel. Any tightness?
Yeah.
Restrictions?
Uh-huh.
You might be surprised by what you notice about your own muscle tone.
It's a fun experiment,
Yeah.
and you might learn something new about yourself.
Cool.
Now, let's shift gears and talk about another type of tone abnormality,
Right.
dystonia. Dystonia is definitely more complex
Yeah.
than the other tone abnormalities we've talked about.
Yeah, our source material describes it as a prolonged involuntary movement disorder characterized by twisting or writhing repetitive movements and increased muscular tone.
That's a mouthful, right?
It is. It makes it sound pretty uncomfortable.
It can be.
Yeah.
Imagine your muscles constantly contracting and twisting,
Okay.
often in ways you can't control.
So it's not just stiffness then.
Right.
There's actual movement involved.
Exactly.
Wow.
And these movements can be slow and sustained, or they can be rapid and jerky. They can even lead to abnormal postures that can last for a long time.
Our source mentioned that these postures can sometimes become permanent.
It's true.
Which is a bit unsettling.
It is.
And like we've seen with other tone abnormalities, the causes of dystonia are all over the map.
Right.
From genetic disorders to brain lesions to side effects from certain medications.
Absolutely.
It seems like there's always more than one possibility when it comes to these neurological conditions.
Absolutely.
So sometimes dystonia is the primary issue.
Right.
Like in primary idiopathic dystonia.
Right.
Idiopathic meaning doctors aren't sure what causes it.
Exactly.
But dystonia can also be secondary to other conditions.
Right.
Like Parkinson's disease or Wilson's disease, which is a genetic disorder that affects copper metabolism.
That's right.
So many different potential culprits.
It's true.
And to add another layer of complexity, dystonia can affect just one part of the body.
Right.
Or can involve multiple muscle groups. Our source gave the examples of spasmodic torticollis, also called Rhineck, and writer's cramp.
Those are both classic examples of what we call focal dystonia, meaning it's localized to one area. In spasmodic torticollis, the neck muscles contract involuntarily, causing the head to tilt or turn to one side.
Gotcha.
Writer's cramp, as you might guess, affects the muscles in the hand, making it hard to write.
I've actually seen someone with torticollis before.
Oh, really?
It looked really painful.
It can be.
Yeah, and for someone who writes for a living, writer's cramp can be incredibly frustrating and debilitating.
Absolutely.
But dystonia can also affect larger areas, right?
Yes, it can be segmental.
Meaning
it involves two or more adjacent areas of the body.
Okay.
So you could have both torticollis and dystonia in your arm, for instance.
And in the most severe cases, it can affect the whole body, leading to generalized dystonia.
That's right.
And in those cases, people often have trouble with basic movements, like walking and talking.
Yeah, it can be very debilitating.
This is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is.
It makes you realize how crucial early diagnosis and treatment are.
I completely agree.
Yeah, if you're experiencing any kind of involuntary muscle contractions or abnormal postures, it's important to see a doctor.
Absolutely.
To figure out what's going on.
Yeah. Early intervention is key.
Speaking of figuring things out, let's circle back to the assessment of muscle tone.
Okay.
I'm curious about how healthcare providers differentiate between all these different types of tone abnormalities.
That's a great question.
Because as we've seen, these conditions can be pretty subtle.
They can.
And there are so many factors that can play a role.
Absolutely. That's why a thorough assessment is so important.
Our source material talks about a 3-step process that clinicians typically use.
Right.
Okay.
The first step is observation.
Okay.
The clinician will watch the patient's posture at rest, looking for any signs of abnormal muscle tone.
Like what?
Things like stiffness, floppiness, involuntary movements, or any differences between the left and right sides of the body.
So essentially looking for anything that stands out.
Precisely.
Gotcha. Then comes passive movement testing.
Right.
Where the clinician will gently move the patient's limbs through their range of motion.
Exactly.
And they're feeling for resistance or lack of resistance, right? And paying attention to how that resistance changes with the speed of movement.
Right.
Because remember, spasticity is velocity dependent, while rigidity isn't.
Exactly.
So the way the muscle responds tells you a lot about what type of tone abnormality might be present.
It's a key piece of the puzzle.
And finally, there's active movement testing.
Right.
Where the patient is asked to perform specific movements on their own.
Exactly, like raising their arms or kicking their legs.
And the clinician is watching for any signs of weakness, incoordination, or abnormal muscle tone during those movements.
It seems like they're really looking at the whole picture observation, passive movement, active movement, to get a sense of how the muscles are functioning.
It's a holistic approach, for sure.
It is.
And of course, this all happens within the context of a complete medical history and physical exam.
Right.
The clinician will also ask about any pre-existing conditions, medications, and any recent injuries or illnesses.
Because all of those things can impact muscle tone as well.
Exactly. It's all about connecting the dots.
It is.
And it's important to remember that muscle tone isn't static.
Yeah.
It can change throughout the day.
Yeah.
And in response to various stimuli,
It can.
I hadn't thought of that. What kind of things can cause those fluctuations?
Stress, fatigue, changes in temperature,
Okay.
even having a full bladder can affect your muscle tone.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is.
It really emphasizes how interconnected our bodies are.
It really does.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder to pay attention to those subtle changes in our bodies. They can give us valuable clues about our overall health.
Absolutely.
So, dear listener, take a moment right now and tune into your own body.
Okay.
How are your muscles feeling? Do you feel any tension or stiffness?
Right.
Are your movements smooth and fluid?
Yeah.
Just by paying attention?
Right.
You might learn something new about yourself.
It's all about awareness.
Speaking of awareness,
Yeah.
let's shift our focus now to what can be done to address these tone abnormalities. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what happens when muscle tone goes wrong.
Right.
But let's talk solutions.
Yeah.
What can actually be done to help people who are struggling with these tone abnormalities?
Well, the good news is that there are often ways to manage and improve muscle tone.
Okay.
The approach really depends on what's causing the problem and how severe it is.
Right.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So, for example, if someone has spasticity after a stroke,
Right.
what might that look like?
Physical therapy could focus on stretching and strengthening exercises
Okay.
to increase their range of motion
Yeah.
and loosen those tight muscles. Medications like muscle relaxants might also be helpful
Okay.
in managing spasms.
And what about hypotonia, where there's not enough muscle tone?
In that case, therapy might focus on building strength
Okay.
and improving muscle activation and control. There are also strategies to help with balance and coordination,
Right.
which can be affected by low tone.
And dystonia, with those involuntary muscle contractions.
Right.
What are the options there?
Dystonia often requires a team approach,
Real.
combining medications, therapies, and sometimes even surgery.
Wow.
It really depends on the individual and their specific needs.
It sounds like finding the right combination of treatments is key.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember that managing tone abnormalities is often an ongoing process.
It is.
It takes patience, persistence,
Right.
and a willingness to adjust as needed. But it sounds like there's hope for people to make real improvements in their lives.
Definitely. With the right support and guidance,
Okay.
people can often make significant gains in their function and quality of life.
That's so encouraging to hear.
It really is inspiring to see.
So for anyone listening who might be dealing with any of the things we've talked about today, what's your advice?
Don't give up hope.
Okay.
Reach out to your doctor, a physical therapist, or a specialist in movement disorders.
Right.
They can help you figure out what's going on and create a personalized plan.
Okay.
You're not alone in this.
There's a whole community of experts and people with lived experience
Right.
who understand what you're going through.
It's about finding the right team
Yeah.
and working together to achieve your goals.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into muscle tone,
Right.
I think the biggest takeaway is that our bodies are incredibly complex, but also remarkably adaptable.
They are.
Even when things go wrong,
Right.
there's often a path forward.
Absolutely. It's a path that requires knowledge, awareness, and a commitment to self-care.
But it's a path that can lead to a richer, more fulfilling life.
It can.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep moving forward.
We are, as always, Claudia and Carlos have an excellent day.